Hello, and welcome back to another video on this website. My friend and I here were just having a very enlightening conversation. No, you can't hear what he's saying, but I assure you it's quite profound. Yes, good point. See, the other day, my friend and I were getting some work done, as we adult humans do, and decided that a distraction was warranted. Something to keep your mind at ease while you toil away studying for your math exams. It just so happens that the distraction I had in mind was a small limited series released recently on Disney Plus, of all services. Here, you should probably, sit up there. Amid the incessant onslaught of Star Wars content that Disney has been pumping out recently, every once in a while, you find a little gem in there. In between all of your Solo, A Star Wars Stories, and Books of Boba Fett's, you get your Mandalorians and Clone Wars Season 7. Now, I'll admit, Star Wars Tales of the Jedi did not sound very exciting to me. As far as I understood, it was just going to be some basic limited anthology series following a bunch of characters I did not know or care about. But as it turns out, I probably just read the description for some other show and was totally wrong. Star Wars Tales of the Jedi is a 6-episode series with 3 episodes following the development of popular character Ahsoka Tano and 3 episodes following less popular character Count Dooku. And as it turns out, the show was quite good. Would I put it up there with Empire Strikes Back or The Last Jedi? Who's to say? Maybe I would. I wouldn't put it up there. I just wanted an excuse to say something positive about The Last Jedi so we could get rid of a few people. No, Tales of the Jedi was something different. See, the 3 Ahsoka Tano episodes were, in my opinion, the least exciting aspect of the series, and as a result, I don't really have a whole lot to say about them. They mostly fill you in on things that you already knew happened, but are nonetheless exciting and perhaps emotionally satisfying to see play out on screen. Now, what I'm more interested in are the 3 Count Dooku episodes. Episodes 2, 3, and 4. I like how I did the 1, 2, and 3. Like I'm counting 1, 2, 3. Episode 4. Up until this point, we really haven't gotten much of Count Dooku beyond a generic Star Wars baddie that really doesn't stand out amongst your Emperor Palpatine's, General Grievous's, and, I don't know, Kylo Ren's. Do people still talk about him? Just realized I didn't mention Darth Vader. It feels like... We've always been told that at some point Count Dooku was a protagonist. He was a Jedi, a very powerful Jedi. I'm also now realizing that saying his name over and over again kind of undercuts the thematic purpose of this video. Count Dooku. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to be referring to Count Dooku as Chris. It seems at long last, Star Wars has realized that just telling us that this character was once a hero is really not enough to get us invested in his story or get us interested in why he's a villain in the first place. Now, finally, we're given the chance to see Chris as his disillusionment with the Jedi Order begins to grow, as he begins to see some of the failures of the Republic and the Senate and of the Jedi themselves, and begins to realize that there may well be a better way to lead the galaxy. Episode 2 sees Chris take his Padawan, who they seem to think we don't know the identity of, but it's Qui-Gon Jinn. They just, like, they name drop him at the end, and I'm like, oh really? Wow, the character who looked like Liam Neeson was Qui-Gon this entire time? But anyhow, Chris and Qui-Gon are negotiating a hostage crisis after a group of starving townspeople kidnapped the son of the senator of their world. I didn't bother to look it up, because really, who cares? There's so many freaking planets in Star Wars. Interestingly, when we finally meet the son of this senator, he's not even the slightest bit upset about the fact that he's been kidnapped. In fact, he seems to almost agree with the political philosophy of those who kidnapped him, saying that, well, sure, it sucks to have been tied up and trapped in a barn, but these people are starving and his father is responsible. Tensions come to a head when the father shows up and is understandably upset about his son's kidnapping, and whilst the Jedi, Chris and Qui-Gon, say that they're going to continue an investigation and they'll get back to him with more information, this senator is not interested in any of that and basically just opens fire on a group of people without really knowing whether or not they're guilty or innocent of this crime he's accused them of. And understandably, Chris is upset by this fact and gets a little bit aggressive. He does a little chokey-wokey on our senator here. And I suppose that this moment is kind of framed as almost a shift towards the dark side, right? Ooh, he's using the force choke, and apparently that's a dark side move, which I've never really understood. But he chokes this guy, and Qui-Gon gets upset, stops him, and all's seemingly resolved. The son of this senator tells everyone that he's going to do everything he can to protect these people and to get them the resources that they need, and that he's going to be in some way keeping his father in check. And it ends with a conversation between Chris and Qui-Gon in which they discuss whether or not this is actually going to lead to long-standing systemic change, which is understandable, right? It seems rarely the case that emotionally crying out to a corrupt politician is going to lead to them suddenly changing their ways and doing all the right things. And this episode brings up what is, to me, both a major character and thematic problem with the Star Wars franchise. For this reason, I'm going to try and break this up into kind of two parts. The first is part one, Chris, which is hopefully going to be a bit shorter than part two. I've always understood Chris to be a character who became disillusioned with the Jedi Order, sure, but that his reasons for doing so were always, to some degree, unjustified. Whenever it's discussed in Star Wars media, it seems to be almost universally agreed that Chris's reasons for leaving the Order were unjustified. Sure, he was upset by the death of his Padawan, and sure, he was disillusioned with the Republic, but nonetheless, the Republic is good. The Jedi are good, and therefore leaving the Republic and the Jedi is a bad decision to make. I think this is best exemplified in a Season 3 episode of Star Wars The Clone Wars, Heroes on Both Sides, which I rewatched for this because, I don't know, it seemed like it might be relevant, when Anakin Skywalker basically says almost exactly as much, that the Separatists think the Republic is corrupt, it's not, and so we need to stop them. But Tales of the Jedi basically presents all of Count Dooku's reasons, oh god, I called him Dooku, Chris's reasons, as entirely justified. And, at least for the first couple of episodes, I would argue his methods are also entirely justified. Personally, I don't see a huge problem with using any means necessary to stop a man who's trying to extrajudicially execute a bunch of townspeople for whom he has no reason to suspect of doing anything beyond possibly maybe kidnapping and then not harming his son. And I understand that that's probably a big deal, but as it turns out, if you're willing to put your feelings towards your family over the fate of your planet and of your people, you probably shouldn't be a politician. Nonetheless, his attempt to kill this senator are treated as a bad thing, as part of his turn towards the dark side, which to me almost communicates the perspective that, yes, the Republic is corrupt, but ultimately using violent means to stop it is a bad thing, which kind of flies in the face of a certain film series, perhaps you've heard of it. Oh gosh, the name is escaping me. Star Wars. But we're not talking about Star Wars yet. We're talking about Chris. What, in my opinion, Tales of the Jedi fails to showcase is Chris's change from an aggressive, but generally peace and justice-loving Jedi to someone who's willing to indiscriminately kill civilians and really anyone who obstructs his path. While these episodes are pretty fantastic, they don't really give us a new side to Chris's character. Instead, they just kind of give us a different character. We're just seeing a different guy with the same name. And it's possible that some of this will get filled in. I mean, this is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that we've seen pre-fall Chris, but some of these critiques almost ring hollow when he's right, and nothing's ever done about the things that he's right about. When, at the end of episode 2, they discuss whether or not the resolution of this episode is going to lead to systemic change, it doesn't. We already know. We already know that the Republic never stops being corrupt and that eventually it falls and becomes the Galactic Empire, and I guess those townspeople are just screwed. So in my opinion, this is basically the problem that Tales of the Jedi creates. It pretty much just gives us a good character and then tells us this character becomes bad one day. And I don't know. It's just frustrating to me, I guess. But ultimately, without more context, without more episodes, without more time with this character, it's hard to say exactly where it's going to go. We do see some of his fall to the dark side. I mean, we see him deleting Kamino from the Jedi records. We see him killing Yaddle, which, yeah, this show has a Yaddle episode, so I don't know, get excited for that. I know I was. It's Yaddle, you know? It's Yaddle. But ultimately, I think this is a problem that could be rectified. If we got a chance to see Chris's fall to the dark side, see where his good ideas get replaced with bad ideas, where his understandable and justifiable methods lead to him taking more shortcuts and doing more gross and indefensible things in the future. The other problem that Tales of the Jedi doesn't so much create as much as reveal is a bit harder to fix. Which leads us to part 2, theme. I don't think it's any secret that Star Wars has a bit of a theming problem. The original trilogy is a fairly basic thematic piece of media, right? It essentially tells us that imperialism is bad. That's about it, as far as I can tell. Okay, maybe I'm being a little bit unfair. As far as I can tell, A New Hope is basically that. It's pretty much Empire is bad. And that's cool. For the opening film in a trilogy, it's understandable that you wouldn't want to explore some incredibly deep and thoughtful themes before you even had a chance to get attached to the characters. So then, Episode 5 rolls along, Empire Strikes Back, and it's easily the best Star Wars film to date. Oh my gosh, I'm, rotating here. I don't want to hit anything. It'd be funny, though, if I just, knocked everything over. Here, we'll sit this way for a little while. Empire Strikes Back rolls along, right? And it tells us that, yeah, everything that was said in the original film was correct, but also that these bad people, these monsters, these Imperials, can be those that we care about, those that are close to us. And it does this in 2 ways. First, by introducing us to space pirate Lando Calrissian, who Han Solo seems to treat as a friend, and also as a no-good scoundrel, who ultimately, in an effort to protect his people, sides with this evil empire and turns against his friends. And I think this is a really interesting idea that wasn't explored a whole lot further, but you understand Lando's perspective and you see where he's coming from, and that's kind of the end of it, right? It's like, okay, yeah, you're right. Good people can potentially do and justify and uphold bad systems in an effort to protect themselves and the people that they care about. Okay, fun. Then, of course, Empire Strikes Back hits us with the shocking twist that Darth Vader, thus far the face of this evil empire, is actually the father of our main protagonist. And again, that's interesting because it kind of reveals to us that, oh, people who uphold horrible systems can be anyone. They're not some generic other that you can just shift to the side. They're not just horrifying monsters born somewhere in the deep edges of space who then come to corrupt the good people, right? They're humans. They're us. And I think that's interesting. I think that is thematically, it's a good place to take the franchise. And then Episode 6 rolls along and mostly continues the same themes, although presenting the idea that even when people turn to dark and evil worldviews, they can be brought back. Mostly by love and watching their son be electrocuted by their boss. And that's all well and good. I think thematically, that's a fairly cohesive trilogy. I think we've got a story that wraps itself up fairly nicely and gives you something to think about, even if it's fairly basic. I do have to say, though, that I appreciate the fact that Star Wars has kind of cemented in an entire generation's mind that the concept of empires is a bad thing. I don't know, that just makes me happy, you know? That, like, whenever you say, like, the British Empire, people immediately think of Darth Vader and think, oh, that was probably a bad thing. And it was, and that's nice. So, thanks, George. Then the prequel trilogy came along. And it was not good. It was bad. It had a good movie, but the trilogy was bad. It was not good. But thematically, it was very interesting, because instead of focusing on this whole, like, imperialism, good or bad or whatever, it presented almost a new way of looking at our pre-existing story, right? In this case, the Separatists are more analogous to the rebellion of the original trilogy than the Republic is, despite the fact that now the Republic are our protagonists. Indeed, this is cemented by the fact that the Republic ultimately becomes the galactic empire of the next series. But the theming of the prequel era is kind of all over the place. It's mostly got a very, very heavy focus on political corruption and on the horrors of war, right? And to some degree, it focuses on that. A lot of the thematic holes are kind of filled in by supplemental material in a way that the original trilogy didn't really need. We didn't need Rebels to cement what we already knew about the OT, but the prequels benefited quite a bit from series like the Clone Wars, which gave us a chance to really exist inside this universe and see where all of the characters were coming from. One of the main problems, at least in my opinion, with the prequel era is the fact that it focuses on some of these themes, but chooses to ignore the other ones. They're a little bit dodgier, shall we say. See, as far as I can remember, at no point in the prequel trilogy or in Star Wars The Clone Wars or any other supplemental material does anybody really spend a good amount of time to focus on the fact that the Galactic Republic is literally a slave state. Like not just implicit, like they raise human beings from birth as child soldiers, genetically modifying them to grow up faster so that they can go and die in a conflict that could have been resolved peacefully. I mean, not that it even matters, right? They're slaves. And in case you don't fully agree with that, there are several conversations in Star Wars The Clone Wars in which people argue over whose property the clones are. Go rewatch the first 4 episodes of Season 6 of The Clone Wars, like I did for this video, and realize, oh god. And it kind of makes the Separatists look a little bit better by comparison, because all of their soldiers are mindless robots. I mean, they've got a couple of non-mindless, like, tactical droids, but for the most part, the Separatist army is significantly more ethical in its existence than the Clone Army is. But no, most of the critiques of the Republic come about based on how they treat their citizens, how they treat their member, I almost said member nations, their member planets, their member worlds, right? How the Senate is kind of blind to the needs of its own people. And that's an interesting enough focus, and we get quite a bit of focus on that. The problem is, we know how this story ends. We know that the Republic becomes the Galactic Empire, and every possible concern that the Republic's citizens could have ever had is kind of thrown to the wayside, right? And we know how that's resolved as well when the Empire is destroyed by Luke Skywalker and his band of merry rebels, and all is well. So what we get is this super rich and interesting and complex view of the Galactic Republic, and then it's resolved by the Galactic Republic just kind of disappearing. And all of those themes are just forgotten about, because the original trilogy doesn't focus on the way that the Empire treats its citizens. You get a little bit of that in shows like Rebels, but for the most part, it's like, oh yeah, the Empire is bad, they're violent, and they're willing to destroy planets, and go out into the world now, I guess, with that knowledge. But we had a chance to fix this. So this is where the sequel trilogy comes around. And say what you will about it, but I think that it has some interesting themes to dissect. At least 2 of the films have some interesting themes to dissect. The Force Awakens kind of gives us a rehashing of the plot of A New Hope, but with unique takes on each of the emotional beats in the film. Some of them, I would argue, are better, and some of them are a bit weaker, right? The destruction of the Hosnian system in my opinion, doesn't really have the same gravitas as the destruction of Alderaan in A New Hope. Although I will say that the Hux speech beforehand is a very fantastic little, like, fascist introduction to the universe. By contrast, I would argue that the death of Han Solo, spoilers by the way, is a bit more of an effective moment than the death of Obi-Wan in A New Hope. So, The Force Awakens is a good way to ease people back into this story that we've been away from for several years. In fact, we haven't seen another Star Wars original trilogy movie since the 80s. Ultimately, Star Wars The Force Awakens kind of serves the same purpose as A New Hope, and as a result, doesn't differ from it thematically in many significant ways. Although, I will say it brings up a very interesting point in the ways that stormtroopers are treated in this universe, because it introduces us to the idea that actually they're kidnapped from birth and trained as child soldiers, much like some other characters whose names are escaping me. So yeah, that plot thread is interesting. Let's see what they do with it. Just kidding, they do nothing with it. Then, for the briefest moment, the sequel trilogy remembers that the prequels exist. Episode 8, The Last Jedi, is all about how the Jedi Order was bad, the old ways were harmful, and that the way that the Republic functioned was fundamentally dysfunctional. Say what you will about several of the moments of the film, and I will, but it remembered for like a second that the Star Wars universe exists beyond just episodes 4, 5, and 6. And then The Rise of Skywalker came along and dropped everything, not only from The Last Jedi, but also from The Force Awakens, and it was just a bad film for bad people. The way I phrase that kind of sounds like I'm saying that if you liked The Rise of Skywalker, I'm calling you a bad person. That's not what I said, but it sure does sound like that's what I was saying. I guess what I'm getting at is that if you look at the Star Wars universe chronologically within the universe, it can be a little bit frustrating because it feels like each era of Star Wars just downgrades in theme. The prequel trilogy is focused on all of these rich and complex machinations of a bygone republic. Then the original trilogy is fairly basic about the crimes of imperialism, and then the sequel trilogy is just a mess. It's just all over the place. It doesn't have any cohesive theme at all. And while that's frustrating for us real people in the real world, where I think it becomes tragic is when you begin to consider the lives of the people inside of this universe. The lives of the characters who exist in Tales of the Jedi, these innocent villagers whose focal episode ended on a fairly optimistic and positive note, despite the fact that we know that's not where they're going. And while it's conceivably possible that Star Wars is going to one day go back to this random planet that none of us had ever heard of, it seems unlikely. It seems like the characters in the Star Wars universe, the people who existed before The Phantom Menace, deserved better. Alright, I'm going to be honest, I have no clue if any of that was cohesive or if any of that even made any sense. And I'm not going to know until I get to the editing room, which is just the same room that I'm in right now, but like over there. And if it's not, I don't know, I'm not going to change anything. You're just going to have to read into it what you will. I respect the possibility that I could be missing something, that there's something about this universe that I'm not considering. So I welcome any sort of critique that you might have of this very surface level analysis of Star Wars media. If there's any sort of interest, or if I get interested in it, I might consider going a little bit more in depth into the themes of each trilogy, because I do think that they're very interesting, not always for good reasons, but they are. I just feel as though there isn't really an overarching plan. That when you look at Star Wars not as a film franchise, but as a cohesive history of a fictional universe, you're just gonna kind of see a series of events that happen with no clear rhyme or reason. One decade, all of the characters seem to be building towards a particular point, and then the next decade, they've completely forgotten about all of that. And they're building towards something completely different. And then a decade later, they forget about that and move on to something else. And I don't know. I just think it could be better.